Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of our guests with us. I've been gone for a couple weeks, but it's nice to be back. I was down in Trinidad in Colorado, and I was preaching a meeting there, and it went really well, I felt. That means that people actually showed up, and they were very good to me, so that was a high estimation of that excellent congregation, and it was a great blessing and privilege to be there. But I am glad to be back, and I'm excited to be back. I miss this congregation when I am gone, and I am super thrilled to be here this morning. Now, sometimes, though, when I am doing ministry, I get stressed out by it. It feels like I have so many things that I have to do each week that it starts to wear on me, and it kind of stresses me out because I look at the week of work, and I'll put in 70 hours, and Mark is putting in a lot of hours too, and so he puts in his 60, and I put in my 10. And it's really hard watching them work that hard, and it really stresses me out quite often. Now, seriously though, it does seems like we as a congregation are just so busy doing so much that it is hard to find maybe a day to myself or a day off. Now, if I was you sitting there right now, I'd be like, well, get over it. You're paid to do this. You're the preacher. You want to hear about hard to do Christianity? Imagine working a full-time job. Then you have this preacher who wants to whine about how hard he is working and how taxing it is to watch his other worker with him working so hard. And you're sitting there working every single week, full time. Then you may be homeschooling your kids. You are taking care of your family. And you are still expected to put all this time in to your Christian service. You may be thinking, I'm lucky to get one project done a year. If you knew what I was trying to accomplish in my life, you would not be sitting there as the minister asking me for more time, more time. You need to be doing more, you need to be doing more, you need to be doing more. I get you. I hear you. It seems like sometimes we equate the use of our time with faithfulness. Maybe there's something more going on when it comes to faithfulness than just counting the minutes. I want to look at, in the very early church here, how they used their time. When you think about your expectations in the church and how you use your time, you have to lead a devotional. You may be a deacon. You may be cooking for a family. You may be taking your preacher out for sushi so often that you sit back and think, how do I find the time to do it all? How do I create the time to really give the Lord my best? We're going to look from house to service. And I really want us to really understand how we can serve the Lord effectively without just getting in this idea that it's just about minutes and how many you use. Now, in the early church, they definitely were using their time for the Lord, but I think they did more than just time. They really gave something even more precious, their hearts. Let's look at what it says in Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching in the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayers. And all came upon every soul. And many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. Time is the currency of our relationships. Am I willing to give time to people that apostles, the early disciples, they were willing to give time to the Lord. Now, there's this phrase in these verses that is repeated over and over again, day by day. It really means that this was a consistent habit of these disciples. This was something that happened on a daily basis. But if you look at it, now place yourself in their shoes. Every day, you're going to somebody's house for a potluck meal. Every day, you're going to worship. Every day, you are spending time in prayer. Every day, you're trying to sell something so you can give it to others who are in need. When you look at these verses, do you not sit back and think, where did they find the time for all of this? How did they make time in their lives to accomplish this work? I think we all struggle with this. And so when we read these verses, we kind of just glaze over them and say, well, that's not me. I'm just going to read to the next verses. But I think there's some really good teaching about how we can serve the Lord with our time and really become a tight-knit community, to become stronger disciples, and do it in a way that is meaningful to us. Time becomes so focused sometimes that we forget that it's not always about time. I remember some time ago, and God cares about time. It's interesting that God is outside of time, but throughout the Bible, He says, take up your cross daily. He talks about redeeming the time. But then I had this one elder this one time. Now, I don't want to mention any names, but he was always notoriously late. And so Charity and I were going to have all the elders over to our house for supper. And the supper was going to be at 6 o'clock. But we told this one elder 5 o'clock. Because we knew of this reputation. Now, I can understand when you have a head of hair as well as this elder, and you can part it better than Moses. It takes this elder a little longer than the average person. So the meal was going to start around 6. We had a few people late. It was a work day. And so about 6:15, everybody shows up. And we're still sitting there waiting until 6:30. 5:30 or 5 till 6:30. Who's late for an hour and a half? Now, you know, though, somebody could get mad. You could sit back and you could allow that to ruin your meal. But I think there's some wisdom in not allowing time to dictate your life. You don't see this in the early church. The early church kind of had maybe a little more like Haiti, Africa. You show up, and when you showed up, that was the right time to be there. And when you leave, well, that's when it was time to leave by the time you left. In America, we are so fixated on time that we really lose the purpose behind the time, and we're just watching the clock to such an extent that we forget why we're all there. It's not about adding more minutes or taking minutes away. It's about really investing in what you're doing within that time. Acts chapter 2, verse 42, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching in the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, in the prayers. They were listening, studying the apostles' teaching. There was fellowship among the Christians. People wanted to be there. They wanted to engage in the moment. What I notice about these verses, there's no hurry up. There's no, let's get this over with. Let's move on to the next thing. They were engaging in the Lord's Supper, and they were happy and content to experience it, to be in the moment of it, to tune out all the surrounding stuff, all the concerns in their lives, and just be there. Sometimes the perception of time can be different. You know, they have done studies about this, and you can relate to this. Sometimes you can listen to a sermon that is 30 minutes, and it feels like 5 minutes. You're so engaged in it. It's so relevant. It's meaningful to you. And you sit back and think, oh, I want to listen to this. And then all of a sudden, when the preacher is done, you're like, wow, that only felt like 5 minutes. But I hate to say it, but you also have sat through sermons that have only been 30 minutes. And you finally, by the preacher's done, should have been done 5-10 minutes ago. You sit back and think, that felt like 3 hours. Why is that? Why does sometimes when we are in worship, it feels like it just goes on forever? And then other times, it feels like it just wasn't long enough. People have always debated about worship time. Sometimes people will say, oh, we need to worship longer. And it's not about worshiping longer. Sometimes people will say, let's shorten it. And it's not about shortening it. It's about when you're here, are you here? In our society, we become so fixated on time in America that we don't really experience it correctly any longer. Because when you are truly in the moment and you are engaged, it can go really fast. But because we have so many interruptions in our world, that it's hard for us to just go there and be in the worship, because there's always a text, there's something that you have to do. You think about lunch, and then you have an appointment, and then you have to go to this place and that place. And so you're constantly feeling this rush, and it causes time to elongate and feel longer because you haven't allowed yourself to really be focused on what you're doing. The early disciples were engaged. Now, look at that. Acts 2, 43 to 44. And all came upon every soul. And many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together, and all things in common. Talk about being engaged. That's why when we read these verses, we don't look at it through the scope of time. They were there because they were in a sense of awe. They didn't know how much time has passed. They weren't watching the clock. They weren't worried about the next appointment that they had to get to. They were right there in this moment. And there was this sense of awe. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to move on to something else. They didn't want to go to the restaurant. They just wanted to experience the presence of God and just be there, to feel it, to experience it. Be with God and worship with his people was precious to them. And so instead of worrying about how many minutes or the lack of how many minutes, they were just thankful to worship and be with the Lord. Their commitment to Christ over the clock reaped dividends. Here are the dividends in Acts 2, 46 to 47. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. This daily practice was important to them. But it wasn't about how much time they put in. It wasn't about punching the clock to be there. It was about just being there. And so as they experienced God, they realized it wasn't about longer time or shorter time. It was about quality time. I want to challenge us. We're going to do House2Serve. And on the weekend of October the 15th, on October the 14th, we're challenging our H2H groups, our small groups, to serve. Not because of putting in more time, but because of the desire to make an impact in our community. It's not about how much time am I going to put into this. It's about, is your heart into this? When it comes to worship, it's not about how long we go or how short we go or how long Matthew preaches or doesn't preach. It's really about, am I listening? Am I here? Or is my mind drifted off into what I have to do this week? What's happening in my workplace? What's happening at school? What's happening in my relationships? Or do you just sit back and say, thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to come and worship you. Let me just be here. And I think that's a struggle for us in America. To not be someplace else. For us not to be checking some cell device. Or to be thinking about what I have to accomplish on Monday morning. But just to stop and be with the Lord and His people. This is why it's precious and meaningful to them. They rejoiced in the presence of God. Reminds me of one of our young ladies in the congregation, and she had her boyfriend come to visit, and I saw him and I was talking to him, and I said, oh, when are you going home? Oh, I'm going home Wednesday morning. And then all of a sudden Wednesday night shows up for Bible class, and there he is. And I said, what are you still doing here? He says, I changed my plane ticket. I'm staying an extra few days longer. I said, oh, what a great idea. When are you leaving? Oh, I'm leaving Sunday morning. All of a sudden Sunday rolls around, and there he is. I said, what are you doing here? Well, I changed my flight again. I'm staying longer. I think the next Wednesday, there he was. What are you doing here still? Have they not kicked you out? No, I changed my flight. I'm staying longer. You know what that's like, don't you? When you're dating the person that you love, all of a sudden the time doesn't matter. You have never looked at somebody you're dating that you're in love with and say, I have 2 hours for you. Just 2. Nothing more, nothing less. You don't ever say, I'll do 1 hour and 57, but then I got to go. Why is that? Because it's not about the time, how long or how short. It's about being there in the time and being with God. That's why these early disciples really understood it, because they got it, because they were with the Lord. Maybe it starts with you this morning. Maybe you have realized you have wandered away from the Lord and you just need to get back. You got to get centered again. Maybe if you will come to the Lord, ask for prayers, let us help you, let us encourage you. Maybe you're not a Christian and you realize you want to be a Christian because you want to spend eternity with the Lord. If you will believe, confess, repent, be baptized for remission of your sins, rise up out of that water to newness of life, you can do so, because that's the most important use of your time now. Why don't you do so as we stand and sing the invitation song?